This is my sound check. I don't have a mic.
Welcome to another week on the D3 Datacast. And even though there's just a few weeks left in the regular season, it feels like things are really ramping up rather than slowing down. It's going to be another big week, another big show to talk about what is coming, the developing picture around the nation as we head towards conference tournament time and beyond that, the NCAA tournament. How are you feeling about it all, Matt? It's been an exciting season, and we can already tell it's going to come to an exciting finish.
Yeah, we're recording here on Sunday night. Some conferences have finished their play. The NESCAC finished. Their conference tournament is now seeded. They're going to begin play here next weekend. And the conferences that aren't done are kind of wrapping up. So we're getting maybe to like the last week of the regular season for most conferences into conference tournament. I cannot believe we're here already. But we're going to talk about kind of that picture right now. Where do we sit as we look toward the bracket release in a handful of weeks? And maybe who's going to be in line to host? Where are teams sitting in that positioning right now? Also, Zach, we have a guest picker when we get to our pick slate today. You're going to want to see who that is. You're going to want to stick around for the guest picks. But I'm feeling good about things right now, Zach.
I don't think anyone is going to be able to guess who that guest picker is. We've had a few guest pickers, none quite like this one.
Yeah,
I,
this will
I
be a
will
great
I
one.
will say that. I think that's probably the teaser I will leave it with. So let's move right into our 4-point play
Yeah.
here as we take a look back at some of the things over the past week that maybe we were thinking about that caught our eye, were on our mind, as we were observing the Division 3 landscape. And so we have the 4-point play. We use the 4 points of the compass to kind of guide us through that journey of the week before. So let's start in the north. What do you have in your 4-point play at that north compass arrow?
Yeah, I'm going to go to the NCAC and talk about Denison, who got a big 87-70 win over John Carroll on Saturday to put the Big Red ahead of the Blue Streaks in the NCAC race. That race was always destined to come down to the wire, I think. Denison is now 10-4 on the conference season. They have a road game at Worcester and a home game versus Ohio Wesleyan remaining. John Carroll is 10-5, just a half game behind, with a home game to Wittenberg left to play. But even aside from those two teams, DePauw, Wittenberg, Wabash are all three right behind at 9-5. I think technically still alive, maybe for a share of the conference title. 6 teams are going to make the NCAC tournament. I just read off 5 that are basically within a game of each other. That's a bunch of teams that are almost even in the standings. It looks like a wide open race there in the NCAC. It's going to be huge for every program, though, that I just read off because it looks kind of unlikely that anyone in the NCAC is going to be in line for an at-large bid. So, I mean, maybe a percent or two for John Carroll as of Sunday night, but really it's going to be conference champ or bust, basically, for the NCAC, and seeding is going to be all important. Denison right now putting themselves in a good position there, especially with that big win over John Carroll.
And your first point here really is a great segue into what I'm going to do with my 4-point play this week and make a theme of it, right? And the NCAC very much fits into that theme. Part of it was just driven by taking a look at overall our projections, and there's a lot of focus that goes on to, okay, who's going to be in position for at large, who's going to be, maybe those hosts, and so it can feel like we're taking very narrow views. But really, when you look at our projections and using the computer efficiency ratings to run 1,000 simulations to kind of look at what are all the possibilities that are still out there. Really, when you look at overall tournament chances, as of the Sunday night, which the rest of the show is going to be based on, there were 260 men's basketball programs that showed up in those simulations with some sort of tourney odds. Now, it could be an extreme long shot getting in via the conference tournament, right? But that's kind of the fun of this time. And so I really wanted to make kind of a theme of my 4-point play to highlight some of those great races around, to talk about maybe some places where there's actually a bunch of teams in the mix, especially some places where it might only come down to who gets in via that AQ. Because right now, there are over 200, as our simulations show, teams that are kind of still in the mix with tourney chances there. So I'm going to kick it off here and talk about the MIAA. It's a mess of a 4-team race. In a week out from the conference tournament, it truly looks like any of the 4 could claim the league's automatic bid to the NCAA tournament, with the current conference standings ordering the top 4 one way. And then you look at our efficiency ratings and they prefer those order in the inverse. So just kind of shows how close they are. And um, you can you look at how the standings work out and how maybe computers. I looked at Massey. Massey kind of sees it similarly to our efficiency ratings. So just not a lot of clarity there. Um, and that dynamic leads to what we saw in Sunday morning's run of the computer simulations, in which Calvin gets the league's AQ 32.8% of the time, followed by Trine at 31.2%, Olivet at 21.2%, and Hope at 14%. That's an even and deep distribution of odds to secure the automatic bid, and that feels right given what we've seen. Regardless of how some might feel about the exact odds or the order of the likelihood in there, right? I mean, it really feels truly like any of those four could be conference tournament champions and receiving that AQ out of the MIAA.
Yeah. Not what we wanted to see, but it's what we got.
That is true. All right, let's look east.
Yeah, Zach, I'm going to go check out a really fun ending for York College of Pennsylvania. They appear to be headed to overtime at Stevenson on Wednesday night until Ethan Glass threw in one of the most improbable buzzer beaters you'll ever see. Usually when you think of crazy buzzer beaters, you think of full court heaves or maybe an off-balance three-pointer with a hand in the face. This was a high rebound off of one of those crazy three-point attempts, but it hit off the top of the backboard. Glass jumped into the lane and kind of caught and threw in one motion. It was more of a flick, like a chuck, just the ball at the hoop. Just like, I have no time to even shoot this, just throw it at the hoop. It hit the backboard, hit the rim, hit the backboard again, and dropped in. Really more than of a push than a shot. But anyway, it went through the net. It gave York the win. Here's the video. Here's the highlight as tweeted by the York College Sports Twitter account.
Hayburn gets it into Landis. Landis tosses one up, and we're headed to overtime. Oh my gosh! No way! No! No way!
I saw that one Wednesday night on social media, and as I'm watching it, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's going to be kind of a crazy buzzer beater. And then that first 3-point shot misses, and then you go on to see the other part of it, and it's like, oh, that's not what I was expecting. And you talk about it kind of being a chuck or a push, and that's really what it had to be. That was probably the only way that shot was going to be able to get in under the buzzer. Incredible to pull it off, just to get a shot, that a second attempt there that would count before the buzzer went off. But even more amazing to see that one go in. So that was a fun one, because it definitely didn't play out as I thought it was going to play out, even knowing that it was a buzzer beater as I was watching the highlight. All right, for my play in the East, we've talked about the Little East. It's been a tight race all season long, so it's no surprise that I'm going to bring it up here, given my theme. WestCon was the AQ favorite according to the results of our simulations on Sunday morning. They secured the bid 35.6% of the time. That leaves just over 2/3 of the time it was claimed by someone else. And once again, we see a number of contenders. It was 24.4% for Mass Boston, 16.8% for Southern Maine, and 12.5% for Eastern Connecticut. It always feels weird, right, to talk about the Little East and not mention Keene State. And even though they were there at like the fifth most likely according to the simulations, and see their odds drop below 10%, the Owls are still checking in at 8% there, which feels like a lot for like a fifth best option there. It really shows the depth of competition in this league. It's something we've talked about. It's been a league that really kind of has seen dual dynamics of Keene State not being quite as good as some of their recent high level of success, but also a bunch of teams around them really improving this year.
Yeah. And some of those years where Keene State was really good, we had like a Western Connecticut maybe stealing a conference championship or making things close and tough. But it's been a while since it's been as deep and tight as it is this year. So it'll be a really fun conference tournament there in the Little East.
Let's turn our attention south.
Yeah, Zach, Concordia, Texas had a really big leverage game on the road at St. Thomas on Sunday afternoon. Coming into the day, our simulations would give Concordia a 74% chance of receiving an at-large bid should they need it if they had won that game, but just a 13% chance with a loss. That's not purely a play-in game, but you're getting really close to it at that point. Concordia's pressure style made it for an entertaining up and down, back and forth type of a game, but ultimately it was St. Thomas who executed down the stretch and came away with an 8-point win. As I mentioned, Concordia not eliminated from at-large contention, but they're really left to root for bubble teams to lose, for favorites to win, no upsets the rest of the way. And really, this time of year, teams in this position should really be having their sights on that AQ, winning the SCAC tournament. Getting in via the automatic qualification, the only safe path for teams to get in. And I think Concordia, They had a shot. They took St. Thomas almost to the wire, but now they're going to be left with maybe a sliver of a bubble chance. Otherwise, AQ for them.
But maybe close enough where they can get another meeting with St. Thomas and
Yeah.
feel like, hey, let's give ourselves another opportunity. We've got a real chance, right? And ultimately, it's about all those schools that still have a chance by virtue of conference tournament play. So that's what's kind of fun. And another example of a team that maybe could have had a great at-large chance that maybe doesn't so much now, but they do still have a chance, right? Because there still is that automatic qualifier at play. So kind of feeding into why I wanted to make the theme I did here. And so I will continue that in the South with the HCAC, which may be cheating geographically, but I feel like any conference with a school south of the Florence Y'all Water Tower in Florence, Kentucky is considered part of the South to this Michigander. So I'm going to go with it. Again, this is another conference race that we've noted on several occasions throughout the season, so it's no surprise to see that the simulations see the conference tournament as among the most wide open. At this point, a little bit different maybe than kind of we talked about the HCAC race, and as we brought it up previously, at this point, Transylvania is the computers leader for the AQ, 41.6% of the time in Sunday morning sims, followed by Anderson at 29.9, and Rose Holman, who just a few weeks ago looked like maybe the conference leader, at 16.8%. And while the HCAC doesn't have a fourth team with odds above 10%, like some of the others I've been mentioning, Franklin and Mount St. Joseph do collectively with each over 5%. So another one where you're getting five, 4 or 5 deep, and there's going to be some teams that maybe don't have a great seed going in, but they're not necessarily going to be like huge surprises if they end up winning a conference tournament.
Yeah, it's going to be crazy. But any conference that has more than one team that can get to Emory in 500 miles, I think that's south enough for me. And Transylvania, they're the favorite. That's a Kentucky team. I think we can get that one to you.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you. All right, one more point of the compass to go west.
Yeah, Zach, let's look at Claremont Mudscripts and Redlands, who are going to square off on Wednesday night in what will essentially be the SCIAC regular season title game. CMS is in first place with a 13-2 record, while Redlands, thanks to an 86-82 loss that they took to Occidental on Saturday, is a game and a half behind at 11-3. This is going to be the final regular season game for CMS, but Redlands will face Whittier on Saturday following this. If Claremont Mudscripts beats Redlands, they're the outright champs. If Redlands wins, and then if they can go on to beat Whittier, they'll tie CMS in the win-loss columns, but they'll earn the number 1 seed in the SCIAC tournament via a 2-0 head-to-head record, or at least I believe that's probably the first tiebreaker, right? Makes sense. Both CMS and Redlands look to be safely in the national tournament, so they're playing this for seeding and for obviously the regular season championship, and a lot of pride here, right? So and maybe even, let's throw in another thing that they can play for, maybe even a chance to host NCAA tournament games if they can get a pod there in Southern California.
Yeah, it's really interesting race because we talk a lot about the head-to-heads, but each team has suffered some losses. We talked about Chapman making their having their stamp on this race. The game you mentioned to Occidental. So going to be interesting to see if some of those dynamics come out to play in a conference tournament, and see if we get something other than a third matchup between CMS and Redlands down the line. All right, as we wrap up this week's 4-point play, it'd be easy for me to wrap this one up in the West with the WIAC. As just about anyone could win that conference tournament. Another one of those races we've talked a lot. But with some solid at-large candidates, that's maybe a little bit less interesting than another nearby conference, and that's the UMAC. So let's spread the wealth here a little bit. Talk UMAC in this context. Sunday morning simulations gave Bethany Lutheran decent 41.9% odds to secure the AQ, but the conference contains 3 other solid contenders. Minnesota Morris, second there with 28.8% odds on the sim run on Sunday morning, followed by North Central at 17.4% and 11.7% for Crown, right? Making the UMAC another one of those conferences where you go down to the 4th best odds, according to Sunday morning's computer simulations, above that 10% mark that I was kind of looking for when I was trying to sort through which conferences to talk about.
Yeah, another great race. And Zach, you're right. We could get to the WIAC finals, maybe even the semifinals, and it won't even really matter, right? There might be like top 16 implications or something, but you'll probably get a scenario where all those teams are in, or very well could. But this UMAC race, you're playing for only one bid. So there's a lot more on the line as far as these teams continuing their season and keep playing. So that'll be definitely one to watch there up in the upper Midwest.
So it's going to be a big week ahead. Seeding implications for teams just trying to get into a conference tournament. Maybe it's a 4-team conference tournament, a 6-team conference, whatever the case may be. Just get in and see what happens, right? Even if you're the last team in, it's been that kind of year. So it should be a fun, week to see how those conference tournaments really line up. And then the week following, where I think it's going to be a really exciting week. All right, we'll take one more look back at last week by way of taking a look at what you've got is your D3Hoops.com top 25 ballot coming in for this next week. Now, I will admit that generally this time of year, I have major top 25 fatigue, right? I'm like, I don't know. I don't care. We've got a tournament here in a couple of weeks. That'll all figure it out. But I will say that I've been pretty intrigued with just I'll say battle for number one, but it feels like what we had was a team got to number one and kind of fell back, right? It kind of felt like no one could hold on to a claim for number one. And even among that, there have been voters that have gone a lot of different ways. So that's kind of been what's been keeping me invested in the top 25 each week. But you've been pretty consistent with Trinity, Connecticut.
Yeah, everyone's taken losses at this time of the year, but I've been Trinity number one the whole season, and I think they're right there. But I will say, I have Trinity 1, Chicago 2, Randolph-Macon 3, and Emory 4. That group, I'm all considering for number one. I think they're all really even. I think they're all almost tied. So I'm not seeing a big separation right there. I know a lot of people, the number one in the poll was Montclair State, who I have at number 7. I just haven't been convinced of their schedule and how they've won their games, right? But how convincingly have they won all those games? I haven't always been super convinced on that. So I have them more as like a 5, 6, 7 tier with Mary Washington, St. Thomas, and Montclair State. All really good teams good enough to get to that Fort Wayne level or which is typically the Final Four this year will be the Elite Eight. I think those teams are good enough. But right now I see that Trinity, Chicago, Randolph-Macon, Emory group as a little bit above.
And then Mary Washington, number 5, that's another team that had a schedule set up where they could have really staked claim to maybe being one of those teams for number one consideration. Dropped games to Christopher Newport and Randolph-Macon, but just bounced back with the rematch against Christopher Newport, getting a win there. Is that kind of what that combined with thinking highly of them through much of the season that let you say, okay, yeah, like Mary Washington is good, yes, maybe not invincible, but kind of feeling good about them to be the team to round out your top 5.
Yeah, I had been high on them all season long. I liked what I saw when we saw them at the Great Lakes Invitational. I think they looked really good. I didn't drop them too much when they lost that first game against Christopher Newport. And now to see them get the win in the second game, that's kind of like a 1-1 is kind of maybe what would be expected in that type of a matchup. So I still feel good at them, not in that top elite tier, but maybe in that second tier right behind.
Mm-hmm. All right, you want to take us through the rest of your ballot? Because I think there's some interesting things here with like Redlands grouped with Claremont Mud Scripps. I think it was go back a few weeks, when there was, I don't know that we've really gained a lot of WIAC clarity, but I think you basically plugged in 4 WIAC schools at the bottom of your ballot, and maybe we're getting just enough clarity, but you still kind of have Stevens Point and La Crosse, tied at the hip.
Yeah, it's tough to say. It feels like every week in the WIAC, teams are kind of going 1-1, and you're like, yeah, you played another good team and you beat one and you lost to one. That's kind of how it is. I do still have Stevens Point and La Crosse in at 21 and 22, but teams like Whitewater and Oshkosh and Platteville, they're probably in that like tier that's right behind the top 25, in that maybe 25 to 40 range somewhere, where there's still a bunch of good teams that are really strong that can play with any of these teams. So the WIAC is still strong and deep there. Maybe a couple teams I did bring in for the first time this week, or at least first time in a while: Carthage at number 24 and St. Joseph, Connecticut at 25. I know what St. Joseph, Connecticut has done recently has been kind of beat up on GNAC teams, which isn't always the most impressive things, but they've won some good games. They beat NYU earlier in the year, who's another team that was maybe in contention for that type of a spot there at number 25. So I think they have a good resume. They've played some tough games, and their losses have been really close, even going back to the beginning of the year. They played maybe Montclair State's one of their toughest games. They lost to them by, I think, 4 or 5 points. That was really strong. They played Trinity, I think, within 4 or 5 points. Like I said, they beat NYU. So even earlier in the season, even when they were taking some losses, St. Joseph was showing that they could play with anyone.
And that's an interesting point, just to kind of talk general voter philosophy, or just to get some insights on a voter. Because if you look at just this past week, or maybe past 2 weeks, maybe there's not anything in St. Joseph, Connecticut's recent results that would point to definitely like this is the time to bring them back into the top 25. But if you start taking a look back, like, okay, let's look back at some of those earlier results, and like, how do I think about them now in the totality of the season that we've seen so far? Right? Like that seems like kind of a perfect example where if you're willing to just kind of take a step back, look back at those previous results. Okay, how did I think about, a team a month ago versus now I'm taking another look. How do I feel about some of those results and this team now? Maybe that is kind of giving the better picture of, why did they get ranked this week? Whereas if you're just looking at, okay, what were the, 1 or 2 games maybe they played this previous week, like it doesn't seem to necessarily compute.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm trying to look at how good do I think the team is, right? Not just a series of season long wins and loss tallies. And I'm not doing a resume ranking here. I'm still trying to be, if they played or they were in the tournament or whatever next week, how would I think the results would go? And I think St. Joseph is that good. I think they're about the 25th best team in the country.
All right, so let's turn our attention to some more topics about that upcoming tournament, and who might be there, where some of those games might be played.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things when we talk about, okay, are you getting into the tournament? And then once you're solid enough into the tournament, it's who's going to host? Like, what are we going to host? I think a good place to start in that conversation is in the pre-championship manual that the NCAA puts out for Division III. They talk about selection for sites, hosting criteria, and they prioritize in order. Number 1 is complete bid. You sometimes talk about or hear people like us talk about submitting to host. A school that wants home games has to file the correct paperwork with the NCAA saying we are willing and able to host these games. If they do not submit that bid to host, they will not be considered. And you can't say at the last minute like, "Oh crap, can we do that?" I don't know if I'm allowed to say that word on the show, but usually they cannot accept a bid late, right? There's a deadline, and you have to file the paperwork. So the complete bid has to be done. Number 2, you have to have facilities able to host people and accommodations, right? That means blocks of hotel rooms. That means your gym can hold, I don't know what the number is for the first round, like 600 people or something like that. And you have to be able to have shoot around times available, things like that. So your facilities have to be able to host. I've only heard through the grapevine of a handful of locations around the country that would not be able to host at their current facilities. I don't think it's crazy requirements. Number 3, the geography has to work. So we talk about the 500-mile rule. That's where the NCAA will bus teams. So typically, they will not choose to fly teams when a place would be determined where they could bus teams. So if you are a island type geography team, it's less likely that you will be able to host than a team with a lot of schools nearby you. So if you can make a pod work with teams within 500 miles, then that fulfills kind of the number 3 criteria. Number 4, when we get to number 4, that's the seeding bit. We talk a lot about you need 16 first weekend hosts. 16 pods of 4 equals 64 teams. So this, you talk about being in the top 16, that puts you in line to host, but seeding is not a guarantee. We see it here as the 4th bullet point on the list where seeding comes into play. So you have to fulfill the other criteria before you get down to seeding. So there are things that might override seeding, and let's just know the NCAA says that can happen. They like to give, I think, the top 16 maybe priority or first crack at it, but these things have to be in order. And I will go back to that quality and availability of facility. I think that's more like yes or no, do you meet the minimum thresholds, not just we're going to go to the nicest, biggest place necessarily. But facility availability and quality is a factor. And then number 5, I've really never heard of this coming into play. Attendance history, hosting history, revenue potential. I've never heard of we went to A rather than B because we thought they were going to sell more tickets, but theoretically that's in here too.
And I think as it goes back to like size of facility, sometimes the way to get around that is they'll do like split sessions where they,
Sure.
yeah, it might be like a 600 seat gym. Like I think Montclair State is one that has like a small gym, right? So you can kind of double the capacity by selling it in terms of two different sessions instead of just, like one block where you get both games. So um, ways around that perhaps that help offset the revenue potential, attendance, that kind of stuff that a bigger facility might have as an advantage.
Yeah.
All right, so obviously we can't break down. We don't have any control about who's completing bids, and um, I guess the decision making that goes into the number of hotel rooms and that kind of thing. But assuming that Division 3 institutions with men's basketball teams that are good enough to be competing at a level for a top 16 type seed have kind of the requisite facilities, to be able to be in line for hosting. Let's talk about those teams that could receive that kind of seeding preference. And we talk about the top 16 kind of being nominally the preferred
Yeah.
hosts, or the places where a committee would like to be able to have host as long as everything else is in line.
Yeah. Yeah. So really, you want to be in the top 16, right? I know Dave McHugh on Hoopsville is going to have a show later on talking about the top 16. He's going to talk to the committee about these teams and these scenarios. So we'll definitely all be tuning in to that later in the week. But here, we're going to go once again back to our simulations. There's 4 teams that 100% of the time, they always showed up in the top 16. It's 4 teams I talked about being tied at the top of my ballot: Trinity, Connecticut, Emory, Randolph-Macon, and Chicago. Every single time that we ran a simulation on Sunday, those 1,000 simulations, they always ended up in the top 16. So they're 4 teams that are very likely to be in position to host. After that, there's a big group of very likely teams: Mary Washington, St. Thomas, Texas, Montclair State. Oh, and I guess actually Tufts shows up as 100% of the time that they always ended up in the top 8. Now, that's probably because they have the NESCAC tournament left, and those are all going to be good games, kind of no matter what. So if they get a win or two, or maybe even if they don't win, it's a good enough team that's not going to kill their resume. So those 8 teams basically locked in to host. You can probably throw in Wesleyan and Christopher Newport. That's 10 teams that are 90% or above to be in that top 16. And I think those all look really good to host. Other options that have a high likelihood: Mount Union, they're at 78%, Gustavus Adolphus at 85%, Illinois Wesleyan at 70%, and then Endicott at 75% is really high on this list. Then you're getting into kind of dicey territory. Claremont Mudd Scripps 57%, UW Stevens Point 54%, Hood at 54%. That gets us to 17 teams. And probably we're going to have 15 or 16 hosts coming from that group of 17 just right there. But there are still teams below that have some chance of getting into that top 16 depending on how their rest of their season breaks down.
Mm-hmm. So you can go to d3datacast.com/NPI to see, based on the games played so far, like what are those teams ranked in the top 16. But, less where teams are ranked in that snapshot of time is kind of less interesting than, where might teams be ranked when it's all said and done after the conference tournaments, right? Because that's really kind of what it's all about. So it's, where NPI is maybe interesting, but kind of the thing we're after, or trying to, gauge the overall odds for is, where is NPI possibly heading? And running the 1,000 simulations helps capture all the various, well, not all, but as many of the various ways that all the games left to be played could play out, to try to figure out, like, hey, what does it look like is most likely? What are the things that are maybe still possible that you maybe wouldn't necessarily know? Yeah, so shout out to Wash U with their top 16 chances there still. That'll excite some people out there, I know.
Well, and so even below this list at the 20 top tournament percentages is what this list is. There's even some WIAC schools down below, like UW Oshkosh and UW Whitewater, that have, some decent odds left. But it's like Wash U and those WIAC schools, they have a lot of opportunities still to get good wins. We know all the UAA games are basically going to be those quality win bonus games. If Wash U, what do they have left? 3 regular season games. If they won all those games, they would continue to elevate in this list. They still have good opponents. Those YACs, if one of those YACs goes on a run, they could join this list to join maybe UW Stevens Point, who's on this list. So if you have a bunch of good games remaining and you win those, that's when you really see yourself rocketing up these lists this time of year.
Well, if you look at through games played on Sunday, the 15th of February, like Stevens Point is 15th in the NPI, and then you've got Lacrosse 22, Whitewater 23, right? So someone is going to win the WIAC tournament, and by definition, they would have gotten a bunch of good wins and not taken an additional loss to get there, right? So that's kind of like, even though you see like a Stevens Point right at kind of the fringe of that top 16, or Lacrosse and Whitewater just maybe on the outside. If one of those three wins the WIAC tournament, you feel like you'd expect one of those teams to for sure be in that top 16 range.
Yeah, add up all those odds, and you probably get close to 100%, and it's pretty likely, right, that the winner of the WIAC ends up being that one team that's in the top 16, or maybe one of the teams that's in the top 16. All right,
okay,
Zach.
so yeah, you mentioned the geography and how that comes into play. So that's kind of where typically things get messed up, from a hosting criteria standpoint that you went through. Generally the facilities are kind of like a yes no, and obviously getting your paperwork in is a yes no type thing. It's really that geography component that can throw a wrench in awarding the top 16 the actual right to host. So let's talk about some of those things. And obviously, at the top of that list is our island schools, whether that be whether that be California, the Pacific Northwest, or in the case we're going to talk about here, Texas.
Yeah. I think the first one I'm looking at right now is Texas. And the reason I'm looking at it first is it's one of those Region 10 kind of quote unquote island areas. But as we're sitting right now, it kind of seeds very nicely and very naturally. St. Thomas looks like they're the top seeded team in that area, maybe a top 8 overall seed. Let them host. Trinity, Texas, now in a different conference, they're looking like they're a pretty good bet to either win the AQ out of the SAA or an at-large bid. They would be kind of seeded naturally to play in the off game. The ASC champion, whether that's looking right now like Hardin-Simmons or Mary Hardin-Baylor, they would be seeded pretty well to play against Trinity, Texas. And then I would just say, fly in a lower seeded team from anywhere else in the country to fill out that pod. You have 4 pretty natural teams here. Thankfully now you'd have 4 different conferences represented, and the seeding is very nice. You're not really forcing the issue to get teams just close. It's a good pod. I know the Texas teams maybe don't like playing each other all the time, but at least here you get different conferences, pretty accurate seeding, at least as it looks now 2 weeks out. And yeah, you're not forcing the issue too much.
Can I bring up here, for the sake of discussion, the fact that Trinity has already played Hardin-Simmons and Mary Hardin-Baylor in the regular season, and so that would be forcing a rematch of a matchup from the regular season. That even if there's some other things that kind of naturally work out for a Texas pod, that is a dynamic that in more densely populated sections of the D3 map would be able to be worked about. So it kind of feels like there's still, it always comes down to still some sort of disadvantage that those island schools have to deal with.
Yeah, that's something the committee will have to consider. I know we've seen different sport committees, including men's basketball in the past, talk about liking to avoid rematches when possible. To me, though, that's a nice to have rather than a need to have. So things you could consider would be flipping it. So have the ASC champ play St. Thomas and the someone else you fly in play Trinity. That messes with seeding a little bit much for my liking. To me, where I come down is Trinity's in a different conference than the Hardins, and they're in a different region. So that the fact that they played a cross-regional game, that's something maybe you can't predict too well. I know they're both in Texas, but they're in different regions of the country. That's a cross-regional game in my mind. I think you do it. It's not a conference game. They didn't play twice this year. I would do it this way, but that's maybe a conversation the committee has.
That's a good point. I mean, avoiding a regular season rematch is maybe less of a deal than a conference rematch. Yeah. And St. Thomas also played both Hardin-Simmons and Mary Hardin-Baylor. So that's really not even a solution there either. Yeah. All right, the other one that's kind of a geographical oddity that maybe gets overlooked is Emory. And they're a team that for sure is going to be in that hosting range, but geographically they can be a difficult team to put a pod together with that 500-mile rule in play.
Yeah, down in Atlanta, Georgia, we're not geographically dense down there, so it can be tricky. So I'm always looking, and Emory's a team that's usually highly seeded. So what can we do there? I think again we're looking pretty good for making a pod work. Emory would, as a higher seeded team, would want to be playing a lower seeded team. So I'm looking right away at the USA South champion, whoever that is, whether it's like a Pfeiffer or a NC Wesleyan, something like that. I think they can. Almost all those teams can get to Emory in within 500 miles, depending on who the HCAC champ is. If that was like a Transylvania, we called them out as being the highest odds there. They can get to Emory actually in 500 miles. Even a team like Hanover, which maybe is like the 5 or 6 seed. Is that a 6 team this year? I'm not sure. If that's a 4 or a 6 team tournament, but a team like Hanover could get there potentially too. So a couple of options. And then for the off game, I'm looking really at picking 2 of Maryville, Roanoke, or Rhodes. I think maybe Rhodes popped their own bubble on Sunday when they lost to Center. They may be an AQ or bust type team. But you probably, there's a world in which none of these 3 teams get in if they don't win their AQs. But I think you feel good about getting 2 of them in maybe, and they could go in there. Also looking at the possibility of flying in a team like Whitworth from the Northwest Conference, obviously another island school. They could plug in at Emory as well. So maybe pick 2 out of those 4. And I think you have a pretty nice, well-seeded pod there at Emory. So I think Emory works out. I don't think we have too many geographic challenges there right now.
Yeah, we know Whitworth or whoever the Northwest Conference champ is going to be is going to have to get on a plane, and right, so there's some advantage of that, and you could put them wherever works best to make the seating and the pods work out, right? Once you're on a plane, you're on a plane, so you can go anywhere. We've seen some interesting placements for some of those teams that had to travel, so that will be one to look out for as well. All right,
I do think though, when getting on a plane, I think they like to avoid though getting on a plane, flying somewhere, and then driving like 6 more hours to somewhere else remote. So a place like Atlanta would be nice to fly to, I think.
Exactly. Yes. Good point. All right, we talked about California, another one of those places in Region 10, where there's an island. Question always comes when there's kind of multiple tournament contenders, as there will be this year with at least Claremont Mudscripts and Redlands, not discounting the possibility that someone other than those 2 teams wins the AQ out of the SCIAC there. So what about a California pod?
Yeah, one thing they could do is force CMS and Redlands into the same pod. They're allowed to have teams match up in the round of 32 from the same conference. Never in the first round. I think that's always to be avoided. We've seen it sometimes in both Texas and Southern California where it happens in a potential second round matchup. I like to avoid these as much as possible, but seeding wise right now, the way it's looking, that would be fairly natural to put them in the same pod. That wouldn't break seeding. But I think because of geography elsewhere, I would maybe look to do something else. What I would look to do is maybe seed the champion. I'm assuming whoever wins that is kind of a top 16 type of a team. Seed them as such, but then you'll have to find an alternate site, probably in the Midwest, to host that. So maybe like in St. Louis at Wash U, they could be the second highest team in that pod, but maybe you could host a Midwest pod with Wash U and a WIAC school and CMS in the same pod. You could do something like that. I think where it gets really tricky, though, and probably will force a host in Southern California with 2 teams from the same conference, is what if CMS and Redlands both get upset in that conference tournament? Then we're probably looking at 3 bids from the SCIAC. In that case, you probably have to host a pod there, put that 3rd team in the same pod, maybe fly the Whitworth in, and then bring someone else in, and then one of those, either CMS or Redlands, does not
the lower seeded.
Yeah,
the lower seeded probably flies out.
So those are kind of 3 options. My favorite one is to, let's say it's just a CMS and Redlands get in. I think fly them both out to kind of Midwesty type pods. We'll look at this will flow into the next bullet point. I think there's too many Wisconsin schools, too many WIAC schools to host from that conference, especially if we want to split them up and not put 2 teams from the same conference in one. So I think I kind of see both Claremont Mudscripts and Redlands going into kind of WIAC type pods to some degree.
And with 2 teams in California, or the same would be true if we were looking at a year where you'd be looking at 2 Northwest Conference teams, right? You're either talking about 2 flights in or 2 flights out, right? It's 2 flights either way. So there's a lot of different ways you could go with that. So I think those are the interesting things to look at, the decisions that a committee will have to make.
Yeah, using our projected bracket, which is not what's going to happen. There's going to be more upsets and whatever than we project, but you could minimize at 3 flights by doing the Texas pod we just recommended, hosting in Southern California with both teams, fly in Whitworth, and then you'd have to fly one more team in. So that'd be 3 flights. My preferred fly them both out is a 4-flight scenario, but I think it builds a better bracket, so we'll have to see where that goes. So then our fourth geographic scenario that I'm running into here is too many WIACs. I think we're running into a lot of simulations where there's 5 WIAC teams that make it. It's not guaranteed, but I think there's a good chance or a decent chance that 5 of those teams do make the national tournament. If that happens, and if you want to split them up, you run out of places to host them. So this is one reason why I like splitting up the SkyAx, is because you can make more Midwest pods and not have 2 SkyAx in the same conference pod and not have 2 WIACs in the same pod first weekend. But even still, you run into geographic challenges. So one choice I've tended to make in mock brackets, and I have an example coming up soon here, is you maybe have to move a host. So a team like Mount Union could be seeded as a top 16 team. You can't quite get UW-Whitewater to Mount Union in 500 miles, so maybe you still seed Mount Union as the quote-unquote host there, but you actually have to move that to maybe the NCAC champ or the MIAA champ. So again, submitting your paperwork, if you're Calvin, Olivet, Hope, Trine, DePaul, Denison, whoever the other team that I'm forgetting, did I say John Carroll? Like, you all want to submit hosting paperwork in the event that you get in and you're a good spot to bring UW-Whitewater, let's say, and or maybe some other WIAC even, and Mount Union together, and you're the best middle location. So even if you're not top 16 or bound to be top 16, you might have an opportunity to host games, get your paperwork in as well.
And just to talk through a little bit about kind of the options, right? I mean, we talked earlier about, even though there doesn't look like in the current top 16, like a surefire WIAC school, someone is going to win that conference tournament and kind of propel themselves probably into that category, right? So you got to figure there will be one WIAC school in the top 16 that's going to be a host. If you've got 4 more, you've got to put maybe like one at Chicago, one at perhaps like a Gustavus, Illinois Wesleyan, right? So it's just a matter of, do you actually end up with enough places to put 4 other WIAC schools without putting them in the same pod as whoever that host ends up being?
Right. Yeah, that's where it gets a little bit tricky and challenging, and that's where committees, if they run into that, might have to start making those decisions. You have not great options, and when we talked to Cam Fuller, this is maybe one of the things I was getting at. It would be ideal to give all the top 16 teams to host. It would be ideal to not have to put 2 teams from the same conference in the first pod. It would be ideal to allow deserving Region 10 schools to host, and again, not have to have a conference mate in the same pod. We don't get all of those things, so they have to make decisions between suboptimal options. And there's sometimes there's multiple reasonable choices you could make, and they're going to have to come to a decision based on what's best for the teams, the bracket, and the student athletes.
So let's talk about a bracket. As a person who does some mock brackets for fun in your spare time, let's talk about it. Now you can joke about this, and you've already alluded to the fact that it's going to change, but really it's kind of going through this process that really provides some of the insights that you're able to provide before, where once you have to actually put some group of teams together, you start to see where are those places where I'm having to make some maybe difficult decisions, or weigh competing interests. Where are there some? I know that you on social media put out one version of an Emory pod. You were going to say you could write in Sharpie right now. Now maybe that looks a little bit different after Roanoke's at-large chances took a hit following their loss recently against Guilford. But let's talk about it, and again, maybe another opportunity to talk about some of the places where it looks like the committee will have to really make some decisions, as opposed to just making it easy to fill in your top 16, and NPI gives you a 1 through 64 seeding, and you can kind of just do a little bit more of a paint by numbers approach.
Yeah. So I use a 1 through 64 seeding based on our Sunday simulations. And then the way I fill out my bracket is left to right. I write down in gold there the top 4 overall seeds. That's Trinity, Connecticut, Emory, Randolph, Macon, and Chicago, left to right. And then on the bottom in blue, the 5 through 8 teams. This year, potentially they could all meet in Fort Wayne. So I don't have to worry about any geography up through here. So then I just write Mary Washington, St. Thomas, Montclair State, Tufts. That's my top 8. That's how I kind of organize them. And then I come back with kind of what would be the 7 through 16 type slots. And I try to fit them in geographically as naturally as possible while also keeping some seating in mind, trying to keep the 3s on the 3 line and trying to keep the 4s on the 4 line. So then I had Wesleyan matching up with Tufts and Christopher Newport with Montclair. Gustavus and St. Thomas, like that's not going to be a geographic match, but you might just have to plug 2 teams in. Mount Union with Mary Washington, Illinois Wesleyan with Chicago, Claremont Mudd Scripps with Randolph-Macon. But again, Claremont Mudd Scripps in red there, that's a flight. I'm flying them out to host in green, Washington University, to kind of make it that a Midwest pod. Again, I didn't need a WIAC there, but I maybe needed some other teams to kind of play in there. Matched up UW Stevens Point with Emory. That's going to have to be just a flight second weekend probably. And then Endicott with Trinity, trying to keep 2 Northeast teams together. So where I ran into issues, you can see the red flights. I had 4 flights. And then one thing I did, which just because of seeding, I didn't want to force 2 highly seeded teams into the same pod. So I didn't want to put like Whitewater with Wash U. I thought that would be too heavy of a pod there for CMS, Wash U, and maybe UW Whitewater. So I wanted to put UW Whitewater more in a Mount Union pod, but to do that, I had to move John Carroll to be the host of that pod. So I had 2 locations there where the top 16 team is not designated as the host. That's CMS, and that's Mount Union, and I had to host those elsewhere kind of for geographic reasons. So this is a bracket I came to on Sunday night in honestly about 15 minutes, so it's probably not great. There's probably a lot of different things we could do, but I think one thing or a couple things this does fairly well is it separates all the conferences, so we don't have any pods with 2 teams from the same conference. It gets seeding pretty close. Most teams are within 1 and definitely 2 lines of their true seed, according to our simulations, right? Whatever the true seeds will end up. So it's a fairly seeded pod, and it's fairly geographically diverse, and it doesn't truly minimize week 1 flights because you could do it with 3. I did it with 4 here again to avoid the CMS Redlands pod. Not sure what the committee would do there, but that's what I did.
Now, I don't know if you thought about this, but something that was just kind of interesting to me with those 2 California flights is they're both going to Central Time Zone, right? So it's not going all the way to the Eastern Time Zone, right? It's an hour difference in terms of the body clock, and maybe that flight feels like halfway across the country instead of like we saw last year with Redlands going all the way to the East Coast. Interesting. I don't know. I don't know if that's something that necessarily the committee would think about, or if you even thought about. But that just stood out to me with both Redlands going to Stevens Point and CMS going to Wash U.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely thought of St. Louis being a decent option to fly a team from California in. For Whitworth flying into Atlanta, I thought about that. Stevens Point is probably not a great place to fly in and get to, being kind of in the middle there of Wisconsin. So that one wasn't a great one. I did try to think of maybe logical and well-seated places to fly to. So I think that's a partial consideration. I didn't fully just do the time zone thing, but if too often I think we see a team from the East Coast fly all the way to like Boston and play Tufts or something like that. And that's fine. But if you can get them only halfway across the country, I did think about that. Like, does that make sense to make it more Midwest? Fly them to St. Louis rather than all the way across the country. Maybe a little bit of a shorter flight. I don't know if it makes too much of a difference once you're on the plane, but I did think about that a little bit.
Well, that's what Redlands did last year. They flew to Boston, won 2 games, flew home, flew back to New York the next weekend, right? So I think Eric Bridgeland has talked about that in some interviews. Going back to his Whitman days, kind of has done it both ways in terms of do you just stay on the East Coast? But that definitely seems like it had some sort of impact with all the travel that they had to do. Now, as you're going through it, you called out St. Thomas, the St. Thomas pod and the Gustavus pod not being a geographical match, which, that St. Thomas pod is not going to be a geographical match for anyone. And so sometimes the geography can be a limiting factor, but I think that the nature of the tournament this year with the Elite 8 at Fort Wayne, with the combined championship changing that Sweet 16 round to a standalone round, in years past, I think the committee was tasked with at least trying to group those pods should the favorites advance, right? So should the top 16 teams all get through, kind of where does that line up some hosts? You don't really need to do that now. You don't need to worry about how 4 pods line up together. You really only need to worry about how 2 pods
Yeah.
line up together. And in the case of like a St. Thomas or Texas pod, that's not going to line up geographically with anyone, right? So that really seems to be able to give the committee freedom to link it up with, hey, what is the most makes the most sense in terms of creating a balanced seeded bracket.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you played the game of, well, let's just start with assuming those favorites, those kind of top 16 type teams do advance, I think you're left with Emory's going to have to fly somewhere. CMS is going to have to fly somewhere. St. Thomas is going to have to fly somewhere. And then you're left with like Stevens Point and Gustavus anyway. So you're going to have those second weekend flights just based on this bracket. So you might as well maybe match up a Minnesota with a Texas. There's only so much you could do. You could put like CMS with Emory, but then you'd be putting Stevens Point with Randolph-Macon. Like that's also a flight. So you might as well mix things up and not just put Region 10 together or whatever if you can avoid it. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I think it's going to be interesting to see when the bracket finally comes out, because just that second weekend being a little bit different, not having those top 8 seeds being able to meet up prior to a neutral site round, it's going to create a lot of interesting opportunities. I'm very interested to see how that all turns out.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk bubble watch, Matt, because hey, that's a fun exercise, but breaking news, the 64 you went through that exercise with, not very likely to be the exact 64 that the committee is dealing with as they're putting their bracket together. It's going to be all about what teams actually get in, right? So to be able to track that picture, the AQs are going to be won by the conference tournament winners, but in that, that'll be played out. But what remains to be seen is exactly how everything plays out for those remaining bids, those at-large bids, and they will be determined by those final NPI rankings. And so the bubble watch is the view that we've developed to be able to track that based on those simulations, breaking up all the teams into 5 buckets of locks and near locks, those teams that are kind of coming in at 100%, and then teams that are looking pretty solid, not 100% type teams, but definitely kind of above bubble status, right? Those are the teams that are showing up greater or at least 75% of the time as at-large bids when they need it in the simulations. And then you get your bubble categories, kind of those teams, maybe 50 to 75% of the time, kind of your might be on the bubble, but a little bit more bubble in. And then those teams up to 50%, but below that kind of halfway point, we call those bubble out, 25 to 50%. And the other teams that show up with some sort of at-large odds according to our simulations, but are really at a low level. They're probably going to be out when all is said and done, but the simulations at least have identified some sort of path that sees those teams get in.
Yeah, I feel like we're observing a thinning of the bubble that's happening maybe sooner than it did last year. We ran a similar type of view last year. I know at the end it very much does thin, where you get, here's maybe your 3 teams on the right side of the bubble and 3 teams on the wrong side of the bubble. I feel like maybe we're a week ahead of where we were last year. I don't know exactly what is causing that, or if I'm just misremembering what last year looked like. That's very, very likely because it was a whole year ago. But where the true bubble lies right now is with that Johns Hopkins, UW Platteville, Carthage group, then into Roanoke, Brandeis, and Virginia Wesleyan. You're probably seeing like 3 or 4 of those teams get in, and a couple of those teams not getting in, depending on how many bid thieves we see. If there's a bunch of upsets, then things will shove to the right. If there's not very many upsets, then teams will pull in to the left. I think so far simulations have been liking about 2 bid thieves, which seems a little bit light, but maybe that's what we'll see. It just seems like that bubble area is thin. It feels like the last couple of weeks, what's happened to maybe contribute to that. Teams like Calvin have played themselves off of the bubble. I think Whitworth took a loss that kind of played them further down the bubble. F&M still looking pretty good despite their loss. Johns Hopkins is looking pretty good there. Roanoke has taken some losses to look from more solid to maybe bubble out type of things. Fewer teams. We talked about Concordia, Texas, maybe losing a chance for themselves to jump higher up in the bubble. They took a loss. Elmhurst got a good win on Saturday to kind of put themselves higher up on the bubble. They were maybe trending lower. They're looking good. It just feels like, anecdotally, this time of year compared to last time of year, teams seem to be playing themselves off the bubble early than onto the bubble. I don't know if that's just my random opinion or if you felt that a little bit too, Zach.
No, that definitely is. From our account on X, I tweeted out a screenshot from this exact date a year ago, February 15th, and that showed, kind of what our bubble watch showed at that time. And while my point with that post was just to show that the approach seemed quite valid by the time crossed out some teams that eventually won their automatic qualifier. Um, the teams that were in the locks and near locks all made the list, and they were some of the first to come off the board. Uh, Based on their NPI ranking, right? And then that solid category, I think, didn't see anyone miss, right? And their order was pretty close. Um, so anyway, I think based on what we saw going through this for the first time last year, is as the approach seems perfectly valid. But in that view, you're right. I think we were starting to see some locks and near locks, but I think overall those first two categories were shorter, and you saw a lot more teams kind of in that bubble in, bubble out category. And as I recalled it, I think um, I recall some results of kind of why those teams that were showing up as bubble in that time ended up out. Part of it was, as we were watching Sunday play out, I think we kind of turned from last year being maybe a low bid thief environment to a little bit more at least average, if not trending more towards high, right? We had some of those final results kind of were not particularly favorable to the bubble. Um, but also remember kind of how that season ended for Virginia Wesleyan, right? At that time, they were looking like a bubble in. Then they hosted a quarterfinal against Guilford and
Lost.
were not competitive at all, right? And that was a game that they probably really needed as a win in those simulations that at that time saw them as kind of more bubble in. They took that loss, and then kind of converting that game from maybe they win or probably they win, maybe they lose, to they definitely lost. Like, that's going to have a big impact. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, as for exactly why it is, I've been thinking kind of similarly to you. Like, I think there are some teams that are just not in a position that necessarily we expected at this time. Calvin being one of them. Carthage is showing up here, but I think coming into the season, we expected that we wouldn't really be looking at them as a bubble team, whether that be bubble in or bubble out. We've talked about the ODAC, still a very good league, but especially after Roanoke took the loss to Guilford last week, they are a team that moved quite a bit to the right here. Like a week ago, they were in that solid category, and then after taking that loss to Guilford, now they're very much more bubbly in this view here at this time. Bubble out. So it's just a little bit of a different environment, not having necessarily uh, two or three like really solid
Yeah.
contenders from the ODAC. So I think all those things combined
Yeah.
is um, opening up an environment where that's where we're seeing maybe a NESCAC or two, maybe more than what kind of feels
Right.
right for how we view some of these
Or
teams.
higher percentage than it feels like they should be at this point.
Exactly, right. So I think, and again, maybe it's all just kind of very anecdotal or like vibe check type stuff, but I can feel those kind of scenarios and see how that they would maybe be creating this environment that we're seeing. Again, whether we're talking about that space for maybe it to be more NESCACs than we feel should be getting in, or just um, creating a little bit more of a dividing line between the teams that are safe and the teams that are probably just not going to get in.
Right. And I think, like I said, our computers thought on average maybe more like only two bid thieves this year, two or maybe a three, like it's a low number. But if you look at the list and that dividing line between, as you said, teams that are in and teams that are maybe bubble out, if you look down the list, what are the pure bid thief conferences that we see? St. Thomas, Texas, Montclair State out of the NJAC, Gustavus out of the MIAC, Endicott out of the CNE, maybe Trinity, Texas out of the SAA. So maybe that's five with teams that are not even five conferences that have the opportunity to be a bid thief where there's really only one team that's kind of bubble or better. And then after that, you'd have conferences that would need kind of double upsets. So there you'd get like the C2C like doesn't seem like there's a lot of scenarios where either Mary Washington or Christopher Newport don't win the C2C. It's
Well,
possible.
or look at the NESCAC. You've got basically 5
Yes.
teams that if any one of them win, it's really not
Yes.
going to change
Yep.
the landscape for a bubble team.
Right. Similar for the WIAC. Even the CCIW now has, 2 teams bubble or better, and Elmhurst is there lurking. It might take a little bit more for the CCIW to be a bid thief. There's a couple of landmark teams. There's 2 NUMAC teams here. So I think we're getting into a scenario where you could get to the semifinals or to the finals, and you just don't have very many bid thief scenarios left. We still have the opportunity for craziness, but I think that's why the computer is seeing low bid thief number potential right now. And I wonder if that's contributing to a thinner bubble, just like there's kind of the haves and the have-nots right now, and those groups of teams have kind of seemed rather consistent here in this last week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fun to have the discussion and kind of both observe the same thing, where just kind of the shape of this graphic looks different than what it did a year ago.
Yep.
All right, and that just goes to show, every year is a little bit different, and it highlights, I think, why it's smart to, you adopt NPI and you require those dial settings to be consistent for a few years, right? We don't want to create a moving target. We don't want to overreact to anything, and I think this kind of thing just shows that like every year is its own unique beast and can play out. Like seasons are going to play out a little bit differently, just depending on the range of outcomes that go into it, right? So I don't know. You don't want to overreact to something or make a change that is just kind of an anomaly or just was present because of the way that particular year played out.
Yeah.
All right, great stuff, Matt. Having a lot of fun running the numbers, tracking the numbers. It's been a lot of fun to be able to give the entire Division III community this kind of information, whether it's posting the current NPI rankings on a daily basis, whether that be before or in between the official NCAA releases that go out with NPI rankings, running the numbers for the projections, using the efficiency ratings to kind of simulate the rest of the season. If that kind of information is important for you, is really benefiting you as a Division III fan, consider supporting that work that we do on patreon.com/D3Datacast. We've got a great group of people who have volunteered to support us in that effort. We're really proud that we'll be able to present that all on D3Datacast.com without any ads, without feeling like we need to monetize it by putting it behind a paywall. No, when we put it out there, when we launched D3Datacast.com, we really wanted to do so without paywalls, without ads, and really grateful to have found some people that feel similarly and want to support those efforts.
Yeah, I really appreciate everyone on this slide, everyone who has supported us on patreon.com/D3Datacast. We have a $3 a month and a $5 a month tier. If you'd like to choose one of those options and join this community of D3 fans, that would be just swell by us. So thanks so much to everyone who's done that.
And special shout out this week go out to our 3 new members at the Great Job Team level. That's Kent Dernbach, Kevin Mullen, and Gordon Mann. Thanks so much. Good job, team.
Good job, team.
All right, a little bit more show to cover here before we wrap up. Even though this is the way we usually wrap up, Matt, we've got a special guest to bring on for our picks this week. Let's go.
We now welcome in a special guest to D3 Datacast. Joining us from the third corner of our parents' basement, it's the third Snyder child, Laura Geerlings. What's up, Laura? Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Welcome, D3 Data Sister.
Thank you. I do exist. It isn't just you two in the Snyder family. It's crazy.
You're joining us today as a guest picker. You are a notorious ball knower. So you're going to join us for the picks today, special guest picker.
Yeah.
But before we get going on that, Zach, run us down on last week's picks before we get to this week's slate.
We'll show her what kind of bar she needs to live up to in her guest appearance here. So we're actually going to start out our review of last week's picks with something of a bonus pick. We have that Mary Hardin Baylor game hosting Hardin Simmons to get caught up on. It was part of our week 12 picks, but weather delayed it. They played it this past week, so we still want to include that in our picks. If Bill Fenlon is out there, he should cover his ears at this point because the Cowboys chose not to foul up through. The Crew's Hudson Johnson hit a shot to send the game into overtime, where Mary Hardin Baylor eventually got the 93-90 win. It was a 5.5-point computer line as we were picking it, for the rescheduled game last week. Matt, you laid the points. I took the points. That's a point for me. DePaul was a 2-point underdog at Denison, but the Tigers got a big midweek road game and a well-played game between these two teams. Both teams were better than a 2-to-1 assist to turnover ratio, but DePaul had a 42-20 advantage in points in the paint and shot 63.3% overall for the 83-79 win. Matt, you were all over DePaul on that one. That's a win for you as well. We were split as well on the Cortland Oswego State game that saw the Red Dragons go into that one as 1-point favorites, according to the D3 Datacast computer, but they left no doubt in a 66-43 win. The Red Dragons moved to 2 games up in the SUNYAC with 2 to play, so they've clinched at least a share of the SUNYAC regular season championship. We'll look to wrap that up for themselves this week. It's another point for Matt, moving him another step towards wrapping up this year's picks contest. In the MASCAC, Salem State at Worcester State was a battle to claim that spot as the lead contender behind Westfield State. The Lancers were a dreadful 47.8% from the free throw line, but 58.1% from the field. As we were both right, but that the 4-point computer line looked like one that Worcester State could cover at home, which they did in the 91-81 final score. Nebraska Wesleyan had an opportunity at Laura, similar to the one Cortland had at Oswego State, but it was a different outcome with the host Duhawks keeping things interesting in the ARC race with a 72-66 win that more importantly covers the computer line of 5, and we are awarded no points there. And in the D3 Datacast game of the week, it was an important Centennial Conference matchup in Baltimore between Franklin and Marshall and Johns Hopkins, with the computer liking the host Blue Jays by 6.5 points. Both teams shot it about 40%, but F&M turned it over 22 times compared to 11 for Hopkins, as the Blue Jays end up rolling to a 60-43 win, making us both losers on another pick.
All right, so to recap where we are, Zach, you were 2-4 last week to bring you to 35, 38-2 overall. I was 4-2 to bring me up to 44, 29-2. That's a commanding lead for me, Zach. You're running out of weeks to catch up. So I think that this one is nearly in the bag. I think the hay is almost all in the barn at this point. But we got a new week, a new pick slate. So let's get going to this. And Laura, thanks for joining us on this one. As the guest, I don't know if did we talk about this offline? Is Laura going to go first, or is she going to go after we make our pick for each one?
I think we talked about going last. I think that's how we've traditionally handled our guest pickers, but if you want to show a little more hospitality maybe than we've had towards our other guest pickers, we could do that.
No, we'll go you, then me, then Laura. Does that sound good to everyone?
Let's do it.
All right. First game is out in Wisconsin. St. Norbert, 2-point favorites at MSOE. Zach, that makes it your pick.
Yeah, tough to pick against a team in MSOE that I think is a good team. St. Norbert's in control there in that conference, but being 2-point road favorites, I'm always a little wary of road favorites going on the road in conference. That's a tough thing to do. So I'll take the 2 points with MSOE.
All right, Zach, I am going to go the opposite direction of you. I think St. Norbert is, to me, kind of clearly the class of that conference right now. It is a big road game. Road conference games are always tough, but I will pick St. Norbert to cover that 2-point spread. Laura, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks for bringing me on. I'm definitely really knowledgeable about this. So I'm going to go ahead and agree with Matt on this one. I'm doing St. Norbert due to the fact that I think their mascot looks like a knight, and I also majored in engineering at Calvin. So go Knights.
Okay. Also, MSOE is Milwaukee School of Engineering. So I didn't know if you're going to go the engineering direction.
I mean, if you really want to play the engineering line, you probably want to go the other way. But
I like the Knight. I like the Green Knights.
I went the Knights. I
Knights.
did go the Knights. Yeah.
That's a good one. All right, we're going down to Ohio for our second game in the OAC. Otterbein at Ohio Northern. This is a pick'em. Zach, who do you like in this one?
Well, I mean, we're going animal against animal here, so I'm really, really interested to see which way Laura goes with that one. But I'm going to go with Otterbein here in a toss-up game. I just like Otterbein as a team overall. It is, a road game, so you got to maybe discount that in the picks a little bit. But just kind of overall feeling like, I like Otterbein a little bit better than Ohio Northern in a pick'em. Give me the team I like better.
All right, Zach, I'm going to go the same as you here. Otterbein is a team I'm voting for in the top 25. Again, Ohio Northern's tough, a tough road game in conference. Don't like that I'm going with 2 road teams right away off the bat. But I'm going to pick Otterbein to win this one outright. Laura, what do you think?
This one was tough for me as well. I'm going to keep it interesting and pick Ohio Northern. So going opposite of both of you.
Ooh.
All right. I just actually accidentally gave spoilers for Zach's pick. So Laura's going with the Polar Bears there. Our next one will take us out to Wisconsin, UW Whitewater, 4-point underdogs at UW Stevens Point. Zach, your pick?
We talked about how difficult it is to win on the road, and it has been certainly the case in the WIAC with that crazy race going on. Stevens Point may not be home dogs, but they are dogs at home. Give me the Pointers.
Yeah, Zach, I will agree with you as well here. UW Stevens Point to me is a little bit stronger. I mean, everyone in the WIAC is almost tied, so this is tough to even pick a 4-point line. But I'm going to go with the home team here to cover. I feel like that's the way the WIAC has gone this year, is home teams winning. So I'm going to go with it once again. Laura, your pick.
I'm going to agree. Stevens Point. I love dogs. My dog is laying right next to me, so we're going Stevens Point.
Okay. Molly is famously, though, not much of a pointer.
Okay.
She's just kind of lazy.
Apparently,
She's more of a cat.
apparently Laura's Warhawk is not nearby.
Not today.
All right. In the Liberty League, we have RPI, 2-point favorites at St. Lawrence. Zach, who do you like?
All right. So if I was being consistent in my picks, maybe I would go with St. Lawrence here, another 2-point road favorite here, but I'm going to go RPI. So maybe I'll split the difference and hope to come out 1-1.
All right, Zach, I'm also going with RPI as well. I think that they're strong. They're the leaders in the Liberty League there. 2-point game on the road. Tough to win those games, as we've been saying, but I think they can cover that one. That's a little bit less than a home court advantage there, so I'm going to go with RPI. Laura, your pick.
I'm definitely choosing St. Lawrence here. The RPI logo is not inspiring me at all.
All right, that's a good strategy there.
Mm-hmm.
Our D3 Datacast game of the week, one we've already kind of talked about earlier in this episode, maybe a de facto SCIAC championship, maybe. Redlands at Claremont Mudscripts. This is basically a home court advantage in favor of CMS. Zach, your pick.
Yeah, and you can tell how important this game is in that race, because this is the second time that this matchup has been our game of the week. Yeah. I will take the points with Redlands. It's not a lot of points to work with, but at this point, from what we've seen between these two teams, really over the last couple of years, it's really kind of a coin flip type game. As you mentioned, we are basically dealing in the world of just the home court advantage being the difference, but give me Redlands.
All right, Zach, I'm going to go Claremont Mudscripts to cover this at home. That means they're going to win by 3 or more. It's going to be a close game. It's going to be a crazy game. Going to be a great one, though. That's why we're calling out as the game of the week. Give me the Stags, CMS at home to cover the 2.5. Laura, who do you like in this Southern California battle?
Yeah, this is going to be a good game. Another dog here, and I did drive through the Redlands area in 2010 one time, and it was a nice area, so I'm going Redlands.
All right. Redlands plays a very high-pressure system. Laura, I think you would enjoy it. It's a fun game all the time when Redlands is involved.
I like to be entertained, yeah.
Thanks for joining us for the picks. Just quick before we go, though, do you have any thoughts overall on the Division III season as we sit here in mid-February?
Ooh, it's definitely interesting. It's not shaping up how we thought at the beginning, I'm pretty sure. But, that's why we love D3.
That's why they play the games, as they say. As it turns out, they do not play games on spreadsheets.
And, I love in common, but you really do have to go through the exercise of the games. Yeah.
All right. Well, appreciate having you on, Laura. Don't wait till the end of the 4th year that we're doing this to try to come back on the show. You should have tried to get on earlier. We'll have you on in the future at some point for guest picker.
This was the first time the invitation has been extended, and I accepted right away. So okay. I think it was more on your end.
Well, it was good that Zach extended the invitation to you. That's great to see.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, I appreciate it.
All right.
Yeah.
One more segment to wrap us up for this week's show. It's the mailbag. Just one item here from Graham Dunwoody, who says, if D3 Hoops had a 1v1 contest like the WNBA is doing, who would you pick to win it all? Matt, any initial thoughts? Or you want me to lead off here?
I'll just think of the type of player that I'm thinking of, right?
Okay.
Thinking of someone that has some size, but is not just a true big. Someone that can handle the ball, that can score inside and outside. I don't know exactly who. I don't have a great name. I have a few that I just think of, but these are the same players I think of all the time. So if you have some names, why don't you throw them out first?
Okay, well, Matt, I'm gonna rely on a different question answering technique, and that's not to directly answer the question I've asked, but to answer the question I want to answer, right?
Okay.
And so and maybe to actually give an answer. Like, I agree with your parameters. Now I'm going to give up a little bit of size, maybe. And like Jair Knight is the guy I think of, right? So he may not be quite as tall as some other, or have quite the length of some other players, but like you're going to have a hard time out physicaling Jair Knight, right? So he's a great pick. But here's the one that I really want to answer is not so much who I'm going to pick to like win it all, but we see Jair Knight and Ben Pierce get to play together. I want to see the 1v1 game where they have to face each other.
Oh,
How about
okay.
that?
I thought you were gonna go. Let's make it a 2-on-2, and you get the combo of Jair and Ben because they would hook up for some good plays.
Yeah, I know, but they always get to play again or
Yeah.
play together, right? Let's make them play each other. I think that would be a really fascinating matchup.
I think that's a good game. I just go to the physicality of Jair Knight though. I'm sure Ben Pierce is big and strong as a human being, but compared to Jair Knight, I think he gives up height and strength in that, and maybe that's too much. I'm not sure. The names I initially thought of, I thought of Jair Knight, obviously, just because he's on the D3 Dunks highlights. He can shoot it from the outside. Even though he would be undersized as a big, right? He can out physical you as a big. So he's just
The athleticism
a
to make
different
up
type
for
of
size
person in
disadvantage.
Division 3, even at like whatever he is, 6'3", right?
Yeah.
But then I also thought of a couple guys from U Chicago. I was watching U Chicago. Graham, I know, very familiar with the U Chicago program yourself. Someone like Nick Roper, I think, has size and ability that could do something like this. But also Shane Regan. I think I might be picking Shane Regan. He can score. He can handle a little bit. I think he would be a good player for this. So 2 U Chicago guys for you, Graham, that I think would be pretty good in a 1v1 would maybe be Rope and Shane.
Maybe we can get those two in a 2v2.
That'd be a good game. Let's get it up. UAA, like after the game, just keep the stream on and have those guys play 2-on-2.
It sounds good. All right, Graham, thanks for
Who would you pick in that? I would pick Ben and Jair.
Oh, yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I think it would be a pick 'em.
Okay.
Let's get it set up and we'll add it to the picks.
All right.
All right, Graham, thanks for the question. If you have something for us to address in a future mailbag, you can leave it as a comment on this YouTube episode. If you're watching it on YouTube, get a hold of us on social media at D3 Datacast, and we would love to address anything that you have for us to address at the end of next week's show.
That's our show for now. We're going to get out of here. Good job,
All right,
team.
we got another week to watch. Let's go.